Welcome everybody. My name's James Skeet. Our guest tonight is James Arbib, who is the co-founder and director of Rethink X, a not-for-profit think tank that analyzes the non-linear nature of technological disruption across the economy and its broad implications across society. Its aim is to inspire a global conversation about the threats and opportunities of technology-driven disruption, and to focus attention on choices that can lead to a more equitable, healthy, resilient, and stable society. According to their research, we are on the cusp of the deepest, fastest, most consequential disruption in food and agricultural production since the first domestication of plants and animals 10,000 years ago. James, thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
A pleasure. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Just a little housekeeping before we kick off. Can everyone pop their microphones just on mute, unless you're speaking, of course. Okay, so James, Rethink X have produced reports on the technological disruption occurring in the transport and energy sectors. But I suppose, as being Animal Rebellion, we should first inquire about your work regarding agriculture. Your report details a convergence of revolutionary technologies that will likely see the agricultural sector completely upended in the coming 10 to 15 years or so. These include in vitro or cell-based meat production and foods produced by a process called precision fermentation, which is probably a term that we should probably all get used to hearing. I guess to get everyone up to speed with what we're talking about, perhaps you could give us a bit of an explanation about what some of these technologies are and possibly describe the non-linear way that they're likely to be adopted.
Yeah, certainly, James. Yeah, of course. So, yeah, I mean, there are some technical terms in here. So precision fermentation is actually a phrase that we coined to describe what we think is the most disruptive method of novel food production. And it's really a combination of what you might term precision biology and the age-old process of fermentation that we've used for millennia to produce beer and cheese and yogurts and all kinds of other things. And essentially what we're doing with this process, and as happens in all kind of fermentation processes, are we using microbes to essentially change one compound into another or produce another output, and the output can be alcohol or whatever else. But we can now harness microbes to produce exactly what we want as the output. So we can use it to produce any kind of protein or in fact any kind of complex organic molecule. And I mean, it's an extraordinary process, and it's one that we've been using now for a few decades. So the very first compound, or the very first molecule produced in this way was human insulin. So way back in the old days, we used to produce insulin from the pancreas of a pig or a cow. And it took about 50,000 animals to produce a kilogram of insulin. And of course, it was pig or cow insulin. It wasn't human insulin. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, scientists worked out essentially how to hack microbes to produce human insulin. So obviously a better product, better tolerated, and also sort of free from the constraints of the scarcity that we had. We just didn't have enough kind of pancreases from animals at the time. And obviously the first kilogram produced was hugely expensive. It cost about $1 billion. But as with all kind of technological disruptions, what you see is as production scales up and as we learn and as we use more, the price comes down. And so we've seen, the price of producing compounds through precision fermentation race down this cost curve. So, by about the year 2000, the cost had dropped to about $1 million per kilogram. And today, we're now under $100 per kilogram. So it's just an extraordinary improvement in cost. And so we're seeing precision fermentation now used in all kinds of other markets. So as the costs come down, the market opportunities expand. So we're seeing it used, for instance, in the cosmetics market. So instead of using collagen from animals, we can now produce human collagen in kind of cosmetic products. And we're beginning to see it used in the food space. So, I mean, already 80% of the cheese produced worldwide is made with a compound that's fermented in this way to replace rennet that used to come from the cow's stomach. And so, we're already, most of us are already consuming these types of products. And over time, we think within 3 or 4 years, the cost will come down below about $10, where it becomes competitive with bulk proteins. And that's extraordinary. And the great advantage of these products is, not only are they going to be cheaper than proteins and other molecules produced from animals, but they'll be better in every parameter, because we can design it. The sky's the limit in terms of what we can produce. We can produce almost any protein we want. So things that you just can't, they just aren't cost effective to produce from nature or from animals, we can produce. So, there's an example, for instance, of the cannabis plant, where we produce, a couple of compounds industrially, CBD and THC, because they're the most abundant cannabinoids that are in the leaf of the plant. But there are plenty of over 100 other cannabinoids that we could produce that all have, incredible therapeutic value. But they're too scarce, so it's too expensive to extract them from the plant, to break down the plant into those single molecules. But we can produce them through precision fermentation far more cost effectively. So there are all kinds of examples. So we see this as what we call an ingredients-led disruption, where essentially, we'll start where we need a few scarce molecules, and we can produce them more cheaply through precision fermentation, or where a product is an ingredient into another. I mean, milk's another interesting example where, essentially the protein is only 3% of a liter of milk. And so we can produce the protein through precision fermentation. And we're already, getting towards cost parity with milk that comes from cows. And so, we see it as I'll give you one more example before I shut up and we sort of move on. But the Impossible Burger is one that you might have heard of, an example of a novel form of meat production. And what Impossible Burgers do is they produce a substance called heme, which is it's actually found in the root of the soy plant. But it's essentially the same product we find in blood. So it gives meat the kind of the smell, the texture, the feel that you get in meat that comes from animals. And they add this. It's 2% of the final product, but they add this to essentially their plant-based burger, and it transforms it. It goes from being just a kind of bean patty or whatever that you might describe a plant-based burger as, to one that actually mimics and is much closer to meat. And so, at the moment, it's 2% of the final product, and the protein comes from plant protein, and the oil comes from coconut oil. But over time, as the cost comes down, we'll see that transformed, and we'll begin to produce, proteins through precision fermentation, and then we'll produce the fats through precision fermentation, and so on. So it will take over, more and more of the end product. What's interesting is it's essentially turning the model of food production on its head. So the model we have now is one we call a breakdown model, where we grow the whole plant or animal and we break it down into the things we need. So the cheapest thing, once you've grown the cow to produce, is the meat. You carve it off the carcass, essentially. There's no processing really involved. The most expensive are the single molecules like insulin or collagen or even whey protein. You have to go through a number of processing. I mean, they're essentially byproducts in some way. So, cost doesn't necessarily equal price, but you've got to go through a number of processing stages to get to those single molecules. What the new model is turns that on its head. You start with the single molecule, and then you build up. So the hardest thing for us to do is to produce a steak or the meat or the hide, actually. And so, that's how the disruption will work. That the single molecules will be replaced first, and over time, as the costs continue to come down, but we'll replace more and more of the cow until ultimately we're able to produce the meat more cost effectively than meat from animals.
Yeah. I mean, your report details some findings that are either brilliant news or terrible news, depending on your occupation. They certainly should be taken note of by those working in the agricultural sector as well as policymakers. Just a few of them. Rethink X predicts that the cost of proteins will be 5 times cheaper by 2030 and 10 times cheaper by 2035. You predict that the number of cows in the US will have fallen by 50% by 2030, and that by that time that the dairy industry will have completely collapsed, with precision fermentation only really needing to disrupt, as you mentioned, 3.3% of the dairy market to bankrupt the industry. Your report details how modern production methods will be 100 times more land efficient, 10 to 25% more feedstock efficient, 20 times more time efficient, 10 times more water efficient, and net greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture will have fallen by 45% by 2030. Now, my mother is watching this, and I'm under the explicit instructions to not say fuck or bugger, but to roughly paraphrase your advice to those working in the animal agricultural sector, it's kind of get the fuck out now while you still can, really, which I think roughly correlates to our position as a movement. Animal liberationists are often accused of hating farmers, which, though I wouldn't want to speak for everyone, in my experience is generally untrue. We want to work with them. We're actually trying to give them a heads up that animal farming is nearing its end. And in many ways, it's already a zombie industry, already sort of predominantly kept afloat by subsidies. I think your report stated that 80% of beef operators make 25% of their income from farming, and 36% hold a job outside the farm. So with that in mind, do you foresee any ways that we can mediate the impact on those working in this sector?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, you know, this is one of the reasons we set up Rethink X in the first place. I mean, you know, society generally does a very poor job of understanding how disruption, technological disruption works, or actually how change happens in society. You know, what we tend to do when we forecast the future is we tend to look backward. You know, and then we draw a straight line to today, and then we kind of extrapolate it into the future, and that's kind of how we forecast the future. And we assume that you know, maybe one thing changes, one variable changes, but everything else remains the same. You know, all else is equal is a kind of constant refrain from mainstream analysis. And actually, that's not a bad approximation for the future most of the time. Because if you think of the farming sector, or you think of the transportation sector, or you think of the energy sector, you know, those industries have essentially had the same system in terms of the infrastructure, the value chain, the business model, and so on. You know, for over 100 years now, actually farming for far longer, and so it's not unreasonable to extrapolate that forward. You know, the problem is that those linear extrapolations, when you come up to a period of disruption, are just woefully inadequate. You know, so what we tend to do as a society is we just stumble in to these disruptions without seeing them, and we kind of then have to clear up the mess retrospectively. So the job losses, the destruction of communities, and so on and so forth. And we've done a terrible job of it. And so, you know, Tony, my partner, who was my co-founder of Rethink X, you know, the two of us, you know, have a very similar. Tony spent years studying technological disruptions. He teaches technology disruption at Stanford, and he's written a number of books about it. You know, I've been involved in kind of clean energy and the climate space, you know, for a couple of decades now. And you know, I've studied complex systems sort of most of my life. So, you know, we both kind of have this understanding of disruption and a huge frustration with this sort of mainstream analysis that just projects that, you know, electric vehicles or solar photovoltaics or batteries are just going to, you know, linearly increase, you know, out into the 2040s or 2050s, or even to the end of the century. I mean, there are forecasts out there, you know, from major forecasting agencies that still see, you know, solar energy, you know, below 50% of the global, or renewable energy below 50% of the global mix by 2100. I mean, just ludicrous. You know, no idea. You know, there's an S curve that technology disruptions follow. They go through, you know, they start slowly, they move slowly, and they begin to gather pace. And it becomes exponential, and we got that curve very quickly, and typically, you know, it's 10, 15 years for a technological disruption to happen. I mean, you know, one of the examples we always like to give is of you know, the car replacing the horse in the US over 100 years ago. You know, in 1905, you know, cars represented less than 5%, 2.5% of well, vehicles, if you want to call them that, on the roads of America. By 2025, there were 95% of the vehicles. Like 20 years to go from under 5% to 95%. You know, really rapid disruption. And that was a disruption that, by today's standards, was incredibly difficult. Right, back then you didn't have an oil industry. You know, we used a bit of kerosene, but that was about it. We didn't have the oil refining capacity. We didn't have paved roads. You know, we didn't have any mechanics. You used to go to a blacksmith to get your kind of early car repair. We didn't have any of the supply chains, or actually, you know, we hadn't invented by that point, you know, the moving production line and so on. And you know, most people didn't even know how to drive. So, you know, incredible barriers to change, and yet just 20 years. And somehow we seem to think that replacing the energy industry or the transportation industry today is going to be really difficult. We haven't got enough electric car charging points or something. I mean, we hear all kinds of objections to the pace of change that we forecast. It's just ludicrous. I mean, they'll just be sorted out. What drives disruption are the cost and capabilities of technology. If something is cheaper and better, and the more it is cheaper and better, the more disruptive it becomes, and disruptions happen very quickly. What you have, and the reason you have that S curve, is that you have to understand this as a complex system. You have to understand feedback loops. And what you have in the early stages are what are called negative feedback loops. They're breaks, what we call breaks. They're resistance to change. And and that is strong in the early stages of disruption. You have, for instance, consumers who are kind of used to the old products and kind of fond of it and don't really want to change. You have, all the infrastructure built out, and you've got economies of scale and, supply chain set up, and the industry is really kind of heavily embedded and seems kind of all powerful. And if a disruption kind of begins, then you get a lot of resistance from incumbent interests, from businesses in the space, and they put political pressure on, and all the regulatory structures are built around the old stuff. But as new technology comes along and improves in cost and capability and gets built out, what happens is those breaks begin to unwind, and you get these accelerating forces, these accelerating feedback loops kick in. So you get increasing economies of scale as demand increases, which drops the price even more, and you get consumers begin to go from being skeptical of the new product to sort of desiring it. And you get, governments begin to change regulations to support the new industry because they see the potential. The old industry actually begins to get less and less powerful. And you can even see the kind of social license kind of switch as well, which is another powerful feedback loop. So you get a virtuous cycle for the new industry, and the old industry breaks down. So you get a death spiral for the old. Demand drops, so economies of scale reverse, so the price begins to go up. And that's what we're beginning to, it's what we think we're on the cusp of seeing, for instance, in the transportation market today, where, electric cars are having huge amounts of investment thrown into them. They're getting better rapidly, both in terms of cost, but also capability. Whereas there's almost no money going into developing gasoline cars today. So they're not going to improve in terms of their capabilities. But actually, as demand begins to drop for them, we'll see economies of scale begin to reverse. We'll see the factories running, less than full utilization. We'll see the prices begin to rise. And we're already actually beginning to see the first signs that, for instance, the second-hand car value begins to drop for gasoline cars. And that's a really important accelerator of change, because that makes your lease cost more expensive. If the residual value is less, then you have to pay more during the period you own the car, essentially. And it's so you see the price of the old stuff go up. And so disruptions actually can happen really quickly. And it happens time and time again. But for some reason, our minds like to think in kind of linear terms, and we don't see these kind of complex forces that are interacting that drive these very rapid disruptions. So sorry, I went off a bit off topic a little bit. You're asking about how we deal with the kind of the adverse consequences of change. And the answer is, first of all, to open our eyes, right, to see these coming. These are entirely predictable disruptions. We can start by following the cost curves, and we understand by the mid-2020s, the cost of producing food through these novel methods is going to be cheaper than the cost of producing it from animals. And we're going to see the capabilities vastly greater, as you said earlier. The environmental impact, the impact on water, the impact on our soils, the impact on deforestation, for instance, on all kinds of things, on human health, are enormous. They all benefit the new industry, and that's I think one of the issues we have with trying to change the food system is, unless you have an alternative that's both cheaper and better, it's very difficult to drive change. We can only get so far with trying to persuade consumers to change their behavior voluntarily. Governments are never going to, impose rules to outlaw animal agriculture, until there's an alternative. And so, that's exciting. We now have an alternative coming that is clearly going to be cheaper and better on every parameter. Better for better for food security. Better for the resilience of our supply system. We're seeing with Brexit and the pandemic, concerns about food security, being able to import enough food. We'll see towns essentially completely self-sufficient in terms of their food production. They use anything they want within 10 or 15 years. you know, and actually in terms of their energy supplies as well, as we move to a fully renewable energy system, which will also be cheaper and better than the old ones. So, you know, I mean, there are huge benefits that come with these disruptions. But as you point out, you know, there are also adverse consequences. And the way we deal with it is to open our eyes to start and to begin to plan to mitigate the adverse consequences. Can I add one? So I tend to, you're going to have to start cutting me off if I'm going off on a tangent too much. One of the interesting things about the food disruption, which actually is exciting from this perspective, is almost every other disruption, you know, you destroy jobs in a region and in an industry requiring a certain skill set, and you create other jobs elsewhere that, you know, totally different skill set, totally different geographic location. So you destroy communities, you know, as well as livelihoods in one area, and you create, so the people who benefit from the disruption are entirely not those people who suffer the pain. And you know, what's interesting about this is that, you know, because we won't use nearly the amount of land to produce our food that we produce now, you know, a fraction of the land will be needed to produce, you know, essentially the food that comes from animals today. But we'll have alternate uses, and we might choose, you know, and it's relatively cost effective to do so, to reforest that land, for instance, or to rewild it. And that'll create jobs, you know, that have roughly, well, a similar, at least, skill set to farming, you know, in the same geographic locations, exactly. And so, you know, there is an opportunity to mitigate some of these consequences in the food disruption that we don't necessarily see in other disruptions that we've analyzed. Sorry, I'll let you talk now.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, while the advantages of these kinds of technologies should be clear to everyone, there will no doubt be those that might express concern that in automating our food production, we further separate ourselves from the natural world. Though modernity has brought us many material comforts, it's also brought about a deeply divided culture that has separated us from nature, each other, and ourselves. Many might suggest that without us reconnecting with nature and recognizing ourselves as part of it, we may remain in a state some Native Americans would call Watico, or white man syndrome, which is loosely described as a mind virus of selfishness, with a view that nature is a commodity to be exploited. Do you feel that that's a potential risk, or do you think that there's a possibility that as people transition away from consuming animal-based foods, a shift begins to occur in society, that exploiting others for one's own gratification or for profit becomes unacceptable, and perhaps we begin to assess whether other systems in our society that depend on exploitation are still fit for purpose, our economic system, for instance, as it's clear that we can't live under a system that demands infinite growth, meaning infinite consumption on a planet of finite resources. Can technological solutions to the climate crisis bring about the required shift in consciousness? And are we at risk of just assuming that technology will come along and save us somehow?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's certainly the possibility, you know, but it's not an inevitability either way of some kind of dystopia or some kind of utopia. And I think, you know, we wrote a book that we published last summer called Rethinking Humanity, which deals with a lot of these issues. And you know, what we see with you know, the technological disruptions that we expect to come over the course of the 2020s. And we expect the whole economy to be disrupted, every sector of the economy to be disrupted, and you know, all these disruptions will interact with each other and accelerate each other. You know, we'll see certainly, you know, I mean, we can see already, you know, the information disruption that's happened over the course of the last 20 or so years. You know, we're seeing a disruption in transportation and in electric power, you know, in materials, in food, and so on. We'll see other sectors, you know, disrupted as a result of that. It's transforming our model of production. So you know, our current system is an extraction-based system, as you point out. It's inherently exploitative, and I'll just kind of go back in time to try and explain what I mean by this, because you know what the Neolithic Revolution did when we settled down in cities and began farming, is, you know, inadvertently, essentially, we were locked into what we call an extraction-based production system. But we had to harness, you know, raw materials and human endeavor, actually human labor, in order to produce the things we need. We extracted from the earth, and we extracted from materials, and we extracted from people what we needed. And it was inherently exploitative. And what I mean by that is that once we came into that world, you know, we're essentially in a battle for scarce resources. And And so that triggered, what essentially is the underlying driver of the history of civilization, which is a growth imperative. But we had to grow and progress or be outcompeted. It was exploit or be exploited, dominate or be dominated. And those societies that tried to live too equitably or too in harmony with nature eventually got taken over by someone who didn't. You could kick the can down the road in terms of environmental problems, for years and years and years. And that growth imperative means essentially that environmental degradation and inequality are hardwired into the system, right? I mean, societies that have tried to rebalance in either way have always been outcompeted. This is why, communism or deep socialism haven't worked today, because they kill those incentives to growth. And so, what we've seen through human history is this kind of progression of societies where societies are kind of broken through. They've harnessed technologies and kind of their organizational capabilities, what we call the organizing system, to deliver a kind of higher level of progress. And they've expanded as far as they possibly can, to the limit of their technological and organizational capabilities. And then they've collapsed. Every society has. They've got to the limit and they expand kind of beyond the buffer zone. Right, and you have a few decades of good weather, and then suddenly a few decades of bad weather, and you collapse, you degrade your environment. I mean, Uruk, the first city in Sumeria, that broke through to, I think it got towards 80,000 people or so from a pre-Sumerian high of about 5,000 people. So extraordinary breakthrough, and these are the guys who invented the wheel and writing and so on and so forth. Huge developments. They degraded their soil and they actually had to move the city. So we see a decline in their population and they bounce back and then they collapse again. And then the Babylonians come along and the Egyptians, and every society's had the same kind of problem. They collapse and then you get these breakthroughs. And there's an inevitability to that pattern of history, because of the incentives in the system, this underlying driver. What's really interesting about this disruption or these coming disruptions, we think that this is a fundamentally different production system that's coming through, right? So this is not a fourth industrial revolution or whatever. This is as big as a shift from hunting and gathering to farming. I mean, this is moving from essentially an extraction and exploitation based model of production to what we call a creation based model of production. So we've talked about the build up model in terms of food production. Think of energy production. Right? We build 100% solar, wind, and battery system. You then don't need to harness any raw materials. You've got no flows, through the system. It just produces energy. You've got complete self-sufficiency for all those regions of the earth. The same in material production. We use a lot of the same technologies that we use in terms of food production to produce our materials. And so it's a completely different system of production in that it's about creation, not exploitation and extraction. And it means we've got an abundance of everything. There are no limitations. We've got more than enough photons, electrons, molecules, all the things we need to produce everything we need. And the cost of doing so, the marginal cost, is going to be, it's going to trend towards zero. It's going to be, extremely low to produce all the food. And it makes possible, in the way that we've never had before, we certainly don't have today, a universal basic income that can actually meet our needs, right? An entirely different system. And I think that, you move into that system where essentially you decouple, kind of consumption from environmental impact or any other kind of negative impact. And you have the ability to solve climate change, almost as an outcome of transitioning, of the market forces that are driving these disruptions. You solve poverty, and to some degree, as long as you get your organizing system, your models of ownership and so on, and the way you run this system right, you have the potential to solve inequality as well, because you don't need the systems of incentives, to outcompete other areas, because we've got more than enough to go around. So so in that world, I mean, I don't know how we manifest, and I don't think any of us does. It depends on the kind of structures and organizing system, models of thought, belief systems that kind of develop. But certainly, the concept of kind of hoarding and saving, might disappear. There's no need for it. We don't have to, we have security for the first time in human history. Real freedom, actually. We call it the age of freedom in our book, because we have the freedom to do whatever it is we want. we could waste our days playing computer games, or we could actually do, really meaningful things. We'd be free from, essentially the drudgery of labor and the exploitation that comes with that. And so, we think it's a hugely exciting time, and the potential is enormous, but there are much more dystopian routes we might follow, right? Because at the center of all these disruptions is information. And so we talk of the coming world as the structure of a kind of network and a node, where you have a global information network, connecting people with localized, essentially community production hubs that produce the things you need. And information economics essentially are that of the network effects, and essentially you get very few winners. So what we see, this is why we see these enormous kind of disparities emerging in those platforms and networks that dominate the information space. And information will take over almost every industry. And that's what food is. It's essentially a decoding of the structure of food, and we call it food as software. And if we continue to manage this new emerging production system through our old ownership models and legal system and organizing system, it's a recipe for disaster. It'll make the inequality we see today, seem like nothing. I mean, it'll be it's potentially entirely dystopian. So, it kind of, the outcome depends on the choices we make. But, obviously the first thing is to see, the range of possibilities that are coming along, and then to plot our way towards them. And that's the work that we're very much involved in at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as your work's detailed, these developments in agriculture will converge with revolutions in energy, transport, and no doubt AI as well. We're talking about fleets of automated on-demand electric vehicles, which will render the concept of car ownership completely obsolete, something that will entirely change the layout of our cities. We're talking a decentralized power grid where localized power generation and storage replace centralized power generation of today. All of these innovations, along with the idea that there will be food developers in much the same way that we see software development today. It's clear that as a culture, we're moving towards what spiral dynamics would categorize as a shift to teal consciousness, where our systems of infrastructure begin to resemble living systems. For example, a cell in my finger is autonomous. It doesn't know that it's part of a wider living system. It's just doing its own thing. And these decentralized structures are abundant in nature as they're far more effective and resilient. Humans are effectively network entities. Even what we've been taught about our own brain being in charge of our body is inaccurate, most likely shaped by the top-down organizational structures of the wider society. As some of you might know, we actually have 3 fully functional brains, this one and the others in our heart and our gut. And there's actually been cases of people receiving heart transplants and completely changing personality as a result, which is pretty cool. But I digress anyway. I guess that my point is, as we leave these sort of anachronistic organizational structures behind, it's clear that those who currently dominate the planet's resources are going to fight every step of the way, as they'd rather shit in a gold toilet for one more generation and sentence us all to death in the process than actually change the system. Do you have any ideas about how we might navigate ourselves through this inevitable resistance?
Yeah, I mean, everything you say, I agree with. I think it's, if you think of our kind of industrialized world, it's been, the organizing system. I'm thinking of kind of our scientific models of thought, our democracy, our nation state, our free market capitalism. This is the kind of the winning combination that's kind of spread around the world now. So it's kind of outcompeted all other forms. This really came came out of the kind of the late Middle Ages in really in Northern Europe and the UK particularly, where scientific thought began to predominate, and scientific thought has been incredible, but it's reductionist at its heart. So what we've done is we've broken down the incredible complexity of the world into individual pieces, and we can understand those individual pieces all the way down to the subatomic level. Right, incredible breakthroughs, and it's led to incredible prosperity and progress. But what we've sacrificed in doing that is the kind of the interconnections and interactions between the pieces. And we can see that reductionism reflected across all of society. Right, we can see it in departments of government, for instance, in academia, in the different fields of study that are kind of disconnected and don't necessarily speak to each other. We see it in medicine, as you say, We have experts in different organs, or in eyes or ears or skin or whatever it might be. Very little kind of holism, understanding the interactions of the parts and so on and so forth. So and we actually see it in democracy, for instance, and free market capitalism, the idea of the right of an individual to control his labor, or the right of an individual to vote. I mean, these are all a kind of reduction. In our economic model, essentially talks about the actions of millions of individuals acting in their own self-interest. Approximating the optimal outcome for all. I mean, that's kind of the fallacy really at the heart of free market capitalism in some ways. And so it's permeated through every part of society. And you're right, in nature you don't have that. You have a lot of individual pieces, but they're all connected in this distributed manner, and they all. So I've spent actually a lot of time studying things like mycelium networks, right? And I think there's an awful lot we can learn from that. And what's interesting is the new production system is very much like that. It's distributed. The old extraction-based system of production, but had to be managed at the center, right? It was hierarchical. It was all about scale and reach and harnessing resources to process them and send them out again. And it was by nature centralized and hierarchical and so on. And that's how you had to manage those sorts of the organizations in that production system, and government and regulation had to kind of match that. But the new system is entirely distributed. You think of the information system today, but the industrial model is TV and radio and newspapers and book publishing. And you had narrow distribution channels, high barriers to entry, high cost. You could very easily manage that at nation state level from the center and control the flows of information. But we've had this incredible revolution in the information system. It's now entirely distributed. I've got billions of kind of producer consumers connected together. No barriers to entry, no cost of production, and that centralized system can't control it anymore. We've completely lost control of the flows of information. I mean, you see what's happening with Twitter, and tying themselves in knots trying to regulate Donald Trump, and we see it with European Union and so on, trying to regulate Google and Facebook. How does a nation state control something that's entirely, well, the network, which is global, and so on and so forth. We see it with the virus, actually. Viruses, they don't stop at national borders. They don't care about borders. They cross it. How we can manage and control a virus at a nation state level, is kind of ludicrous to think. So. We've got a system of production emerging that much more closely mirrors what you see in nature and the rules of nature. And I think that if we're going to manage that, and we're going to be successful in moving to this new system, yes, absolutely, we're going to have to learn to both understand it, think like it, but also, to run our societies like that, the organizations and we had a brief chat before this conversation about how you guys are structured. You see the same structure in things like blockchain and Bitcoin and elsewhere, and we'll have to see those sorts of distributed systems begin to take over. And I think we have everything we need. I mean, this is not rocket science, and you're right. The old system will squeal and fight and whatever, but it's always the death throes. They never resist long enough. Someone else will just outcompete them. I mean, the way change happens in these complex systems is it always comes from the edge. You think of industries being disrupted. It's never the incumbent industries that make the breakthroughs and lead the next wave of progress. It's always the guys from the edge who, there's a massive advantage to a clean sheet. You've got none of the incumbent mindsets, none of the incumbent interests or belief systems or interests, to kind of slow you down. You've got complete freedom to build something. And it's been the same as civilizations. We've seen it's never the leading civilization that makes the next breakthrough. They always break down. They always collapse. They always, go backwards and look inwards to try and solve their problems. You see societies that try and, commit more blood sacrifice or appoint more priests or more military power to try and prop themselves up as they're going into their death throes. It never works. There's always someone on the edge who's unencumbered by that kind of baggage that breaks through it again and takes things on. And we expect to see that today. So we don't think there's any chance that China or America or even Europe will lead this in the way we currently conceive of them. You might find a a region or a city within China or America or Europe, leads or works this out. But to get there, it's an emergent process. We're going to have to experiment. We're going to have to try new things. When you see what's happening in the UK or in Europe or America, we're as things are becoming more unstable and more uncertain, we hunker down, we look for stability wherever we can find it. We lose our openness to change and new ideas and so on and so forth. So, I can see zero chance that these regions in the current structure can possibly break through. And so we need to, if we're to be successful, not only do we need to kind of build these decentralized structures, begin to understand the world through that much more kind of complex lens, but we also need to kind of experiment and allow this system to emerge. We're not going to sit in all one planet. We need to create the conditions in which it can emerge. Sorry, that was I need to draw breath.
Thanks, James. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. As much as I'd love to keep you all for myself, I think we need to open it out to everyone else who's here. So, George, do we have any questions lined up from either anyone on the call or on Facebook or YouTube?
Yeah, I think that Kerry wanted to ask a question. Are you still on the call, Kerry?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Great, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Jamie. That was fantastic. Myself and Harley, who also is in the call, we were at the Oxford Farming Conference last week, and we had two back-to-back talks, in fact, about how the industry is going to be disrupted by the introduction of alternative proteins and because of climate change. The two excellent talks by John Elkington and Professor Tim Benton, they didn't really go into time frames of this. So when the talks were over, the farmers, the feel I got from listening into conversations, the farmers understood that this is happening, but they believed this was going to happen in sort of 20, 30 years time. It wasn't actually happening right at this moment. So how do you think we can communicate with the farming communities this is actually happening now, and that this is necessary, and this is a process that's going to be impacting them right at this moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great that you're trying to communicate with them for a start. Our view is, and you can read our reports available on our website. We think by the mid 2030s this will be largely over. I mean, you imagine by then that the only thing we're producing from an animal is a steak, right? The meat. It's the last thing. That meat will have to bear the cost of rearing the whole animal. So you'll see an upward spiral in costs, and presumably you'll have to pay to dispose of the hide. What was an asset that you could use becomes a liability. And so, we expect that the cost of meat by the mid 2030s to be, very much higher than it is today. Several multiples, which means that it's inevitably going to have a much more narrow market, and of course the cost of the alternatives will be far lower, and so we see this happening over the next 10-15 years. But actually, what happens in disruption is the incumbent industry tends to break down relatively early in the cycle, and so it doesn't, it's not a linear process. A 10% reduction in revenues, doesn't mean a 10% reduction in profits. It can mean a complete wipeout of your profits because you have a lot of fixed costs in there, and maybe you have some debt, and so on and so forth. So what we tend to see is incumbent industries collapse very quickly, as the disruption begins to unfold. And it's really difficult to communicate with people whose livelihood depends on believing in, the continuation of the current form. And so, our mission in life really is to make people see or help people see what's coming, which to us is abundantly clear. We can't, we get described as futurists, and I always push back against that, that depiction, because we started describing ourselves as todayist, because we think the lens that we have, the model that we've developed helps us understand what's going on today, and we can see the range of possibilities that are emerging into the future. But the path we follow into the future, entirely depends on the decisions we make as we go along, and those are impossible to predict. And I think for for farmers who are and other people in the value chain who are facing the prospect of loss. I think you're going to find some who see it and actually try and adapt or try and retrain or try and do other things. I think this is a disruption that's in the very early phases, right? And it's only I think people only recently, and only a very small number of people recently have begun to realize how quickly this disruption will unfold or can unfold. And so the first thing is to just share the kind of insight and hope that it triggers something. But beyond that, it's it's very, very difficult. I mean, you can't force people to see what they don't want to see, and that's a great tragedy. I think from the point of view of those farmers personally, all you can do is try and help them understand what's happening. Beyond that, it's really their own responsibility. If they choose not to see it or choose not to believe it, then we have to have a safety net that picks them up when their industry collapses and helps them transition at that point. But you can't force someone to see what they don't want to see.
Lovely. Thanks, Jamie. And Kerry, great question. We also have a question from Rowan. Would you like to say that out loud, Rowan, or would you like me to read from the chat?
Yeah, sure, I can read that out. Yeah, thank you, Jamie. That's all been really fascinating. And I think you've already answered my question a lot. It's just basically focusing on, say, if Animal Rebellion were to do a action or a campaign to help with bringing the knowledge and the insight that Rethink X has been cultivating with all this things like precision fermentation, changing the food industry and so on. How do you think that can best be achieved in terms of perhaps getting the politicians' attention by thinking about economical incentives, or just in the early days, and something like that, or in terms of and you've already said to bring that awareness through giving talks through just sharing that message, perhaps doing talks and trainings just giving talks at educational places like schools. So yeah, just.
Well, I mean, you guys are much better at communications than we are in many ways. I mean, the thing about the disruption of animal agriculture is, look, there's far more than one card that we can possibly play, right? And this was really the argument that I had with a lot of my environmental colleagues when I was involved in kind of clean technology finance. Clean energy is not all about climate change, right? That's one great outcome from a clean energy system, but there are many other reasons why we would want a clean energy system. Right? First and foremost, actually, the economics. It's going to provide us with cheaper energy, but also it's going to be clearly better for the environment, but also better for energy security. We're not going to be dependent on the supplies of foreign, essentially foreign, energy. And that has huge geopolitical and military consequences. And also for resilience, it's a far more resilient system. It's far less fragile because it's so distributed. And it's the same with agriculture, right? There are enormous reasons why we'd want to have this transition beyond just animal cruelty. And I mean, for you guys, clearly animal cruelty is a huge issue, but I know that environment is another huge reason. Yeah, and all the environmental reasons, beyond just climate change that come with agriculture. There are all kinds of negative environmental consequences. Human health's another reason. And I think what we have to be, smarter at in terms of communicating the message is to hit all of these points. A food system that looks like the one I'm talking about to large scale, and that doesn't displace, by the way, plant-based agriculture. I mean, that's something that can live, in tandem with it. This largely displaces animal agriculture. What we have to be much smarter is communicating all the benefits. I mean, there is no reason you could possibly want to keep that system alive, other than the jobs. But if you can find ways to protect the livelihoods and the communities that will suffer from this, then there is no argument not to go down this road. right? From food security to, resilience of supply to, national competitive advantage, to economics, to climate, to animal welfare. I mean, you go on and on and on. All the, everything stacked on one side of this argument. The problem we've had previously is we've never had an alternative that is cheaper or better. We've always had to prop up this industry because it provides cheap calories, right? And so governments have been supportive and others. We're now in a position where that argument just goes away, and we can see the evidence. We're not there yet, but if you see our research and more and more research that's coming out, it's abundantly clear that this is a new paradigm. This is, everything's changing. And I think communicating that to governments and that elsewhere, and working out how to communicate it. We write these kind of dense reports, and I mean, it's a few thousand people, tens of thousands of people will read them. What we would love is for people to take the kind of work we do and others and translate it so it can be understood by school children and by all kinds of other audiences. We don't have the capabilities or in-house to be able to do that, but it'd be awesome if people did, because I think this is so important. And this is not just about food, it's about energy, and it's about transportation, and it's about a blindness. It should appeal both to people who care deeply about the world, but also greed. Actually, this is a huge opportunity for those who lead this as well. And so it just seems extraordinary that more people aren't kind of aware and pursuing this.
Lovely, thanks, Jamie. We have a question from HHHH, who's on the call, but I suspect it may have been answered already, but I'm not sure. So would you like to ask your question, HH? Okie dokie, no problem. We'll move on to, we have a message from Facebook from Swati, who asks, we use bus, train, space vehicles and clothes manufactured by industries. We use gadgets of mobile and internet, and we refuse to evolve when it comes to technology. Why are we in the dark ages? Why are we still stuck in the dark ages when it comes to food technology, do you think?
Well, I don't think there have been, food technologies previously. I think we haven't got to the point where new food technologies have really, really been able to compete. And we've had some pretty horrific kind of manufacturing processes that have come, but these are minor disruptions. These aren't, what we call, this is not sort of systems changing disruptions. So we're just at the early stages here. We haven't had the capabilities previously. These disruptions, we talk about technology convergence in our work. Disruptions often come about through a convergence of technologies. So the smartphone, for instance, came along in 2007, and it's no coincidence that it came about then and not in 2005 or 2009. It was that point in time where computer processing had got to the point, battery technology got to the point, touch screen technology had got to the point. The networks had developed, GPRS technology that allowed, to essentially have an always-on setting, so you can communicate, data constantly and so on. So there's a number of technologies that have to come together, at a certain level of capability and a certain level of cost to allow a kind of affordable smartphone to be possible. And it's the same in most disruptions, and we're seeing the same in food. It's needed a number of technologies to come down that cost curve and get to the point where they can become disruptive. And we're just getting towards that point now. I mean, I say, as the cost comes down, you open up more market opportunities. So we've seen some disruption, for instance, in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals so far. And we're beginning to get to a point where we can become disruptive in food. I mean, the Impossible Burger actually in America is the most popular late night snack now. Apparently, it's sold in every Burger King in America. It's doing incredibly well. There's been a huge explosion in growth. I mean, you look at the growth figures there; they're just, just astounding. And so, it's starting from a very low base, right? And so, it doesn't look like it's doing much, but it only takes, if it doubles every 18 months or every 2 years or so, from 1% to 100% of the market is only 7 doublings, right? And so it can happen pretty damn quickly. but it's kind of hidden from view, and it's hidden from view, and then suddenly bang, it explodes. So it's we just haven't had that. We just haven't had that technological capability before to fully disrupt the market.
Amazing, thanks, Jamie. I think we probably have time for one more question, but no one has posted any other questions in the chat. So I don't know if there's anyone on this call that would just like to jump in. And I know that James definitely has more questions. So I don't know if there's anyone else who'd like to go. Otherwise, we'll revert back to James's questions. Yeah, Toby. Hi, Toby. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you all for organising this. Is a really amazing talk, and thank you, Jamie and James and George. Okay, question with regard to foods technology. We've been talking about animal agriculture, and I think we all agree that we would all like to see a world with a just and sustainable plant-based food system. So, do you think that a just and sustainable plant-based food system would be based on your technology? So we actually get rid of arable farming. You know, there's worker exploitation, there's animal exploitation and death, there's land use, there's soil degradation, and so on and so forth. So what do you think about that?
I think it's certainly possible. So it's not a part of the market we've written about or published on yet. We focused our work to date on animal agriculture. But if we look at what's going on in electric power, for instance, we see, I wish I had longer actually to talk to you about the electric power disruption. So it's a fascinating one. It's completely misunderstood by most people. We expect a fully renewable system in a decade or so, and we expect a superabundance of energy that comes with this new electric power system, because to go to 100%, the cheapest way you can do it is through solar, wind, and batteries, and you have to massively overbuild capacity to provide enough energy for the darkest day of winter, and that essentially for most of the rest of the year gives you this sort of superabundance of energy. I mean, it doesn't have any environmental impact, so it's not a bad thing. It's an amazing thing, because it means you can do things like water desalination. You can electrify, buildings in terms of heat and so on. You can also grow food, and what we're seeing in vertical farming, is an ability to grow a lot of plants at relatively low cost, but the big cost is electric power, and we're seeing the cost. We think at times, if demand is flexible, it can move, demand can move over time, then you could have essentially free energy at those points in time, and so for food, I think there's a huge opportunity to produce and grow, not everything, but certainly a lot of stuff, indoors, using a fraction of the water, using a fraction of the inputs into the system. So I think there will always be a plant-based, a plant. We will eat real food in that respect, but it's it will be taken out of the field and out of the sort of exploitation, the world of exploitation, and move towards the world of creation. Sorry, we're getting to the end, but yeah, a great question.
James, thank you so much for a really inspirational talk. I've loved every minute of it. I would happily talk to you all night. As you might have guessed, I'm an absolute power nerd, so this stuff is like my bread and butter. I love talking about this stuff. I think, and I think it's really important to illustrate a vision of the future and give people, something to aim for that's optimistic. Hopelessness leads to apathy, and I think we can all agree that we're in need of some hope right now. So thank you. I'd implore everyone watching and listening to head over to the Rethink X website, have a read of their reports, take a look at some of their talks on YouTube, and then go out and actually talk to people about these ideas, because inventions that appear in unfertile societal conditions tend not to get adopted. For example, the first steam turbine was invented in 16th century Ottoman Empire, many, many years before we're generally taught in the West, but it never really took root. Imagine how different the world would have been if the Industrial Revolution had happened in the Middle East. So I guess, let's make sure that we're doing everything that we can to bring about this beautiful utopian world where we can sort of sit around playing sitar and braiding each other's hair all day. And thank you to everyone watching and listening. Thanks for all your questions. Do take a look at our upcoming events on our website. We have numerous campaigns running at the moment, ranging from quarantine safe things you can do from home through to perhaps some spikier stuff I'm probably not allowed to talk about. Give us a follow, subscribe, hit the bell if you're on YouTube, all of that good stuff. And I guess we'll see you all very soon. So thanks very much for coming.